The room was silent except for the soft scratching of a pen. A single lamp threw a warm circle of light across a wooden desk. The rest of the space was dark, the kind of darkness that makes you hear your own heartbeat. A stack of thick envelopes rested on one side of the desk. On the other, a man with long dark hair tucked behind his ears and a worn black t-shirt leaned forward. His face calm, his movements steady. The man was Keanu Reeves. To the outside world, he was an action hero, a star of films that had rewritten what audiences believed cinema could be. But in this moment, there was no red carpet. There were no cameras. There was only a signature, then another, and another. Each stroke of the pen was a quiet act that no one else in Hollywood would ever think to do. He paused, resting the pen for a moment. His fingers lingered on the cool metal of the pen's barrel, and his eyes, tired but bright, flicked to the envelopes waiting to be sealed. To anyone else they were simple manila packages. To him they were lifelines, the hidden gestures that would change someone's life without them ever knowing who truly made it happen. Outside, the city hummed with the late-night rhythm of Los Angeles. Neon lights blinked over empty sidewalks, and the occasional car whispered by. But inside, time felt slower. Keanu reached for the next document, the paper thick beneath his hands. The legal text blurred slightly at the edges, but he knew what it said. He had read it 100 times before. He knew that with each signature, another portion of his earnings would be transferred. Not to himself, not to a corporate account, but to the people behind the cameras, the ones who risked their bodies, their health, and sometimes their very futures to make the impossible look effortless. He remembered a stunt from years ago, a rainy night shoot, a man rigged to wires, spinning midair before crashing against a wall in a perfectly choreographed sequence. The take had gone perfectly. Everyone had cheered. But when the stuntman landed, he clutched his ribs and tried to hide a grimace. Keanu had seen it. He had seen how the man smiled through the pain, how the crew patted him on the back like a soldier returning from the front lines. It had stayed with him, that quiet heroism. In the glow of that lamp, the memory was sharp, almost painful. He had built his career standing on the shoulders of people like that man. They were never interviewed. Their names rolled past in credits few stayed to watch. But they were the heartbeat of every film. He flipped to the next page. His hand did not shake. There was no second thought. 'Cause this was not charity. It was justice. Years earlier, when he had first walked onto a set as a young actor, he had been wide-eyed and quiet, learning the rhythms of filmmaking. He had seen how long the hours were, how little appreciation there was for those who held cameras in freezing winds or lit scenes under blistering heat. He had watched as directors barked orders, as producers made demands, while crew members simply nodded and pushed through exhaustion. Back then, he had not had the power to change anything. He had been a name in the background, barely able to afford rent, riding the subway to auditions, wearing the same jacket for months because it was all he owned. But life has a strange way of circling back. Now, decades later, here he was, with success beyond imagining, signing away millions without fanfare, because those memories had never left him. The pen scraped softly again. Another envelope was ready. He placed it gently atop the stack and pressed his palm against it as if to bless what it carried. In his mind's eye, he saw the faces of the stunt crew from The Matrix. He remembered the days they spent rehearsing wire work, spinning in midair, crashing through glass. He remembered their laughter during breaks, their bruised knuckles and bandaged wrists. He remembered the way one of them had hugged him after a grueling shoot, whispering that the money from this job would finally pay off his mother's hospital bills. That was before Keanu even made his decision, before he signed. But that memory, that was the seed. He leaned back in the chair. The room seemed smaller now, heavy with emotion. The quiet hum of the city outside felt far away. He thought about how strange fame was. People wrote articles about what he wore to award shows, about his motorcycles, about his love life. But no one would ever write about this night. No one would ever write about the way he sat in the dark, alone, making choices that would lift others up, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He reached for a fresh pen, uncapped it with deliberate care, and began on another document. His handwriting was clean, practiced. There was no hesitation, only the steady rhythm of ink meeting paper. In that moment, Keanu thought of something his mother once told him when he was a boy. Kindness is not in the things you show. Kindness is in the things you give without expecting anyone to notice. He smiled faintly. The words had followed him through every success and every heartbreak. He had lost people he loved, endured tragedies that could have made him bitter. Instead, they had made him softer, more aware of the quiet struggles in others. The lamp flickered slightly as the hour grew late. He did not stop. Outside, somewhere in the city, a crew member slept unaware, not knowing that tomorrow or next week or next month, an envelope would arrive that would change everything. The sound of boots scuffing against concrete echoed in Keanu's memory as he stepped off a crowded Toronto bus, clutching a script that had been folded and refolded so many times that the edges were soft as fabric. It was the early 1980s. The city air smelled faintly of rain and gasoline, and the lights of cheap diners reflected in puddles on the street. He was 20 years old, still a stranger to Hollywood, and he carried with him a quiet determination that most people mistook for shyness. His coat was too thin for the weather, the collar frayed, but he barely noticed. What he did notice were the faces of the crew on the small television sets he sometimes worked on. Faces lined with exhaustion, eyes that blinked against bright lights after hours of setting up camera rigs, adjusting reflectors, untangling cables. These were the people who built stories out of shadows and light. And though he did not yet have the power to help them, he watched, he learned. Keanu's first serious gigs were not glamorous. He would arrive before dawn, sit quietly in corners, and read his lines with all the intensity he could muster while makeup artists shuffled around him, while gaffers muttered about broken bulbs and faulty sockets, while sound technicians adjusted microphones that kept slipping on their mounts. The actors around him often kept to themselves, guarding their own anxieties. But Keanu noticed the small kindnesses. A cameraman handing his coffee to a shivering extra, a stunt double quietly wrapping another performer's injured ankle while everyone else moved on. These moments imprinted on him, invisible threads weaving into something larger. It was in those early days that he first saw the imbalance. Leading actors went home in warm cars. Crew members often waited in the cold for rides that never came. Checks for performers arrived on time. Payments for crew were delayed, sometimes for weeks. When producers cut budgets, it was not their own salaries they reduced. It was the wages of the people who hauled cables, built sets, and risked injury on dangerous shoots. Keanu absorbed all of this in silence, storing away each observation as though they were pieces of a puzzle he could not yet solve. There was one night in particular that would stay with him forever. The set was a tiny warehouse lit by harsh fluorescent tubes. The production could not afford proper heaters, so everyone shivered through take after take. A stunt performer named Michael was supposed to perform a simple tumble over a crate, but the floor was slick with condensation. Keanu watched as Michael adjusted his pads, exhaled sharply, and then launched himself. The landing was brutal. He saw the way Michael's shoulder jerked, the quick tightening of his jaw as he rolled out of frame. No one said anything. The director shouted, "Cut," and the crew reset the shot. Keanu approached quietly, kneeling beside Michael as he sat against a wall. His breath shallow. Michael waved him off with a smile, pretending nothing had happened. Keanu returned to his mark, but inside something shifted. In those years he was often broke, often lonely, often uncertain if he would make it in the industry. He spent nights on friends' couches, ate meals that barely counted as food, and yet he always found a way to bring a sandwich or coffee to someone who looked more tired than he did. He knew what it meant to be overlooked. He knew what it felt like when nobody noticed your effort. That understanding became part of him, a seed of empathy growing silently as his career began to find footing. As opportunities grew, he carried those memories like secret talismans. He would watch the way famous actors demanded attention, and he would think of the people behind the camera, their names unknown, their futures uncertain. He would see producers celebrate a successful scene while a lighting technician sat on the floor, icing a twisted wrist, unnoticed. It did not make him bitter. It made him attentive. When he landed larger roles like his early turns in River's Edge or Parenthood, the sets were bigger, the stakes higher, but the dynamic was the same. The crew arrived first and left last. The stunt team took risks that no one would ever see in the final cut because the best stunts are the ones that look effortless. He began to talk to them, to listen to their stories. One stunt woman spoke about juggling 3 jobs to afford daycare. A sound engineer admitted he was months behind on rent because a previous production had withheld his payment. These conversations carved deep grooves in Keanu's conscience. There was one afternoon on the set of Point Break when Keanu watched a group of stunt surfers brave freezing Pacific waters for hours. The sun was setting, the crew was shivering, and the director kept pushing for one more take. Keanu stood wrapped in a blanket, silently observing the grit in their eyes, the way they encouraged each other with tired smiles. That night, back in his modest trailer, he stared at the contract for his next paycheck and thought about how many people were making far less while giving far more. He did not yet know how he could change it, but he felt the weight of that injustice settling on his shoulders like an unspoken promise. Hollywood can be a place where people forget the ones who helped them rise. Keanu instead remembered every face, every name, every moment of unseen sacrifice. He began carrying small gestures with him. A gift card slipped quietly to a crew member, a ride offered to someone stranded, a handwritten thank you note after a shoot wrapped. None of it was enough, but each act was a thread in a tapestry he was weaving slowly, patiently, without telling anyone why, even as his career exploded into global stardom with films like Speed. He still rode the subway, still lived simply, still noticed the janitor cleaning the set at 2 in the morning. Those early days had carved humility into his bones. He knew fame was fleeting, but kindness could endure. And so he carried those lessons with him, silently preparing for the moment when he would have the means to do something larger, something lasting. On a quiet evening, long before the world would discover his secret generosity, Keanu sat alone in a rented apartment, thinking about all the people who had made his dreams possible. The hum of a distant refrigerator was the only sound. He stared at the wall, replaying faces, names, laughter, pain. He thought of Michael and the crate. He thought of the stunt surfers, the shivering grips, the sound engineer counting coins for gas money. In that solitude, he felt a decision forming, not yet clear, but inevitable. If success ever gave him power, he would not hoard it. He would share it because he knew what it meant to be unseen. The memories of those early days were not glamorous. They were hard, gritty, and unpolished, but they became the foundation of everything he would do. Every long night on set, every quiet conversation with a crew member, every unnoticed act of bravery built inside him a reservoir of empathy that the world would one day glimpse through the quietest of actions. Those early days were not just the start of his career. They were the blueprint for his humanity. The rain poured down in sheets that night, drumming against the rooftops of Sydney as if the sky itself were applauding the chaos on the film set below. Floodlights cut through the darkness, casting stark shadows of wires, cranes, and scaffolding onto the wet concrete. It was the year 1998, and The Matrix was in full production, a film destined to reshape science fiction, though no one could quite imagine it yet. Keanu Reeves stood under a wide black umbrella, watching as the stunt team prepared for a sequence that had been rehearsed for weeks. The air smelled of ozone and damp asphalt, and the wind whipped strands of his long hair across his face, but he did not move. His gaze was fixed on the crew members suspended high above on intricate harnesses, their bodies silhouetted against the harsh light, their breath visible in the cold night air. In those moments, Keanu felt a duality pressing on him, the exhilaration of creating something extraordinary and the quiet dread of knowing the price others paid for it. He had already memorized every line of Neo's dialogue, already pushed his body through grueling martial arts training, but it was the people behind him, the ones who would never appear on screen, who carried the true weight of this production. He watched as a stunt performer adjusted his pads with trembling fingers, the cold biting through layers of protective gear. Another technician shouted instructions over the wind, his voice hoarse from a day of yelling above the roar of generators. Keanu felt a sharp pang of guilt. He would leave this set with millions. Many of them would leave with bruises, meager paychecks, and stories no one would hear. The Wachowski directors were visionaries, pushing boundaries with every frame, but Keanu noticed the exhaustion in the crew's eyes. Some of them had been on set since before sunrise, stringing cables, adjusting harnesses, and re-rigging broken pulleys while others took brief naps in trailers. He overheard a quiet conversation between two stunt doubles about medical bills piling up at home. Another spoke softly about missing his daughter's birthday for the third year in a row. These were not complaints. They were statements, the kind of truth spoken by people who had accepted sacrifice as part of their craft. Keanu carried those words like stones in his chest. One evening, after an especially dangerous rooftop jump scene, Keanu watched as a stuntman named Mark landed hard, his knees buckling in a way that made Keanu's own body flinch. The crew rushed in, but Mark waved them off, limping away with a grin, insisting he was fine. Keanu knew that grin. He had seen it before. An armor against vulnerability, a mask to hide pain so no one else would worry. Later, in the dim light of the catering tent, Keanu approached Mark, offering him a cup of coffee. Mark's hands trembled as he took it, and Keanu noticed the subtle way he cradled his side. "You did great out there," Keanu said quietly. Mark only nodded, eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup. That moment stayed with Keanu long after the day wrapped, long after the applause faded and the equipment was packed away. Weeks turned into months, and the Matrix became an all-consuming machine of creativity. Keanu's days blurred into endless cycles of fight choreography, wire stunts, and philosophical discussions with the directors. Yet through it all, he remained hyper-aware of the crew's relentless grind. He watched them fight through illness, through injuries, through weather that seemed designed to break their spirits, and he began to wonder, what would happen to them when the cameras stopped rolling, when the final wrap party ended? Would their sacrifices be remembered? Would anyone care? Late one night, sitting alone in his hotel room, Keanu stared at his contract spread across the bed. The numbers were staggering. Bonuses, residuals, back-end deals that would secure him financially for life. He thought of the stunt team who had spent hours perfecting the iconic bullet time sequences, the camera operators who hung upside down for shots, the set builders who constructed entire cityscapes from scratch. He thought of their quiet conversations, their tired smiles, their laughter despite the pain. He thought of Mark's trembling hands. A deep sense of responsibility settled over him, heavy and undeniable. He had never been one for extravagance. His apartment was modest, his wardrobe simple. He rode public transportation by choice, not necessity. Money to him was a tool, not a trophy. And now, as he stared at the zeros on that contract, he felt a clarity that surprised even him. These millions were not just his. They belonged to the people who had made him look like a hero. They belonged to those whose names would never be known outside of industry circles. He reached for a pen and began making notes in the margins of the contract, scribbling figures, calculating percentages, envisioning how to divide the bonuses in a way that felt fair. The next day, between takes, he quietly approached a producer. Their conversation was brief, almost inaudible over the din of the set. Keanu asked questions, precise and deliberate, about residual structures, about bonus allocations, about how much freedom he had to direct funds. The producer gave him a puzzled look, but answered honestly. By the end of that day, Keanu had a plan forming in his mind. A plan to sign away a substantial portion of his earnings to the very people who had risked their safety for this film. He did not tell anyone. He did not announce it. He simply began the process, setting in motion the paperwork that would quietly redistribute millions of dollars. Back on set, the work continued. Rain or shine, the crew gave everything they had. Keanu's awareness of them deepened, each day revealing more of their resilience, their humility, their artistry. He began staying late after his own scenes wrapped, watching them dismantle rigs, coil heavy cables, and test dangerous stunts again and again until perfection was achieved. He offered small gestures when he could, a meal, a ride, a word of encouragement, but he knew those gestures were only temporary salves. The real change would come later, in signatures and transfers, in envelopes arriving in mailboxes without fanfare. As filming moved toward completion, Keanu's resolve hardened. The production was grueling, but the team had created something transcendent together, something that would echo through cinematic history. And when that happened, when audiences gasped at the impossible feats on screen, Keanu wanted the people behind those feats to feel more than invisible pride. He wanted them to feel the tangible weight of appreciation in their hands. He wanted them to know they mattered. On the final night of principal photography, as the crew celebrated under strings of yellow bulbs, Keanu stood off to the side, watching. He listened to their laughter, watched them clink plastic cups filled with cheap champagne. Many of them would move on to other projects, facing the same long hours and low pay. But he knew something they did not. Within weeks, a gesture would reach them that might, in some small way, change their lives. As dawn crept over the horizon, Keanu walked back to his hotel, exhausted but calm. He carried no trophy, no special recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he could turn his success into something more than a personal victory. He thought of his mother's words again, about kindness given without expectation. In the empty streets of Sydney, as the city stirred awake, Keanu felt the truth of that lesson settle deep into his bones. Fame was fleeting, kindness was forever. The Matrix era would become the defining chapter of his career. But in his heart, it was not the fame, not the awards, not the acclaim that mattered most. It was the silent promise he made to those who stood in the shadows of the spotlight, the promise to honor their unseen sacrifices. And in that quiet resolve, Keanu Reeves began the journey from being just an actor to becoming something far rarer. A man whose generosity would ripple outward, unseen but unstoppable. The morning sun filtered through half-closed blinds, painting narrow golden stripes across the surface of a heavy oak desk. The room smelled faintly of ink and paper, the quiet scent of decisions being made. A stack of legal documents rested in neat order, their corners perfectly aligned as if someone had spent hours arranging them. Keanu Reeves sat in a leather chair, shoulders relaxed but eyes focused, as an attorney carefully turned pages and explained each clause. The hum of traffic outside was distant, muffled by thick walls, and somewhere in the background a clock ticked with unhurried rhythm. This was not a glamorous office high above the city. It was a modest suite in a low-rise building, chosen precisely because it drew no attention. Keanu leaned forward slightly, reading every line as the attorney spoke. He was not a man who rushed through things, especially matters that involved other people's futures. His long fingers traced the edge of the first page, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of what was about to happen. The attorney, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sharp mind, asked him again if he was certain. Once these are signed, there is no reversal. You will be forfeiting a significant amount of your residual earnings and bonus payouts. Her voice was professional, but there was a subtle note of concern, the kind one hears when someone cannot quite believe what they are witnessing. Keanu looked up, meeting her gaze. His voice was soft but steady. I am certain. The pen in his hand felt heavier than it should have. He uncapped it slowly, placed the tip against the line, and began to write his name. The strokes were deliberate, his handwriting clean and practiced. Each signature was more than ink. It was a declaration, a quiet message to people who would never expect it. One by one, he signed through the stack, flipping pages with a measured rhythm. The attorney watched in silence, her eyes occasionally darting to the documents, then back to his face, as if trying to read the thoughts behind his calm expression. As he worked, memories rose unbidden. He thought of Mark, the stuntman who had limped away from the rooftop jump, and wondered if Mark's knees still ached when the weather changed. He thought of the lighting crew huddled under tarps in the rain, still adjusting reflectors so the scene would be perfect. He thought of the set builders whose calloused hands had shaped entire worlds out of plywood and steel, their sweat hidden behind the glossy final shots. These faces hovered in his mind like ghosts, not haunting him but guiding him, steadying his hand as he moved from document to document. The attorney explained the structure as he worked. This portion will be distributed as discretionary bonuses to the stunt and effects teams. This section directs a percentage of residuals over time. This clause is for gifts in kind, such as equipment or transportation allowances. Keanu nodded without interrupting, absorbing every word. To him, these were not abstract numbers. They were hospital bills being paid. They were tuition checks for children. They were rent envelopes arriving on time. At one point, the attorney paused, pressing her lips together as though weighing whether to speak. Finally, she asked, "Do you want any of this to be public? You could issue a statement. It would make headlines." Keanu's pen stopped mid-air, and he looked at her with the faintest hint of a smile. "No, this is not for headlines." He resumed signing, his movements unhurried, his mind clear. Hours passed unnoticed. The sunlight shifted across the desk, turning from gold to pale white as the day moved forward. The documents diminished in height, the signatures accumulating like quiet ripples on a still pond. Outside, the world carried on oblivious, unaware that in this unassuming room, a decision was unfolding that would ripple through dozens of lives. When the final page arrived, Keanu paused for a long moment. He let his hand hover above the paper, feeling the gravity of what was about to be sealed. He thought of his younger self riding a subway to auditions, pockets nearly empty, heart full of hope. He thought of the countless crew members who still lived that reality, unseen and uncelebrated. Then, with a deep breath, he signed his name one last time. The pen lifted, leaving behind not just ink but a legacy of quiet generosity. The attorney gathered the documents, her movements precise, almost reverent. "I will begin the disbursement process immediately," she said softly. Keanu nodded, standing slowly, his legs stiff from sitting so long. He rolled his shoulders, feeling a strange lightness in his chest. There was no applause, no cameras, no press waiting outside. Just the soft rustle of papers being tucked into folders, the click of a pen cap, the gentle scrape of his chair against the floor. He thanked the attorney, shook her hand, and stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The air was warm, the city alive with motion, but he walked unnoticed, just another man in jeans and a worn jacket. He moved with unhurried steps, passing shop windows that reflected his figure back at him, though he barely glanced. He was thinking of the envelopes that would soon travel across countries, finding their way to modest homes, small apartments, hospital rooms, and weary hands that had never expected such a gesture. As he crossed a busy intersection, the world around him seemed sharper. He noticed a child tugging at her mother's hand, laughing. He saw a street musician playing softly on a corner, hat open for spare change. He heard the distant call of a vendor selling roasted chestnuts. Life moved on, unaware of what he had done, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Later that evening, back in his simple apartment, Keanu brewed himself a cup of tea. The kettle's whistle was soft, almost comforting. He sat by the window, watching as the city's lights flickered to life, one by one like stars. He thought again of the crew, the stunt doubles, the riggers, the lighting teams, and imagined their faces when they opened the envelopes. Some might think it was a mistake, a clerical error, until the truth settled in. Others might sit in stunned silence, reading the accompanying note that simply said, "Thank you for everything you have done. You made this possible." Keanu sipped his tea slowly, letting the steam rise against his face. He did not need their thanks. He did not need their recognition. The act itself was enough. It was a private celebration of gratitude, a way of honoring the invisible pillars that held up the glamorous facade of filmmaking. He thought of his mother again, of the lesson she had given him all those years ago. Kindness is not what you show. Kindness is what you give without anyone knowing. In that quiet moment, Keanu felt a profound sense of peace. The world might never know what had happened in that modest office earlier that day, but he knew, and so would they, and that was enough. The first envelope arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning. It was unmarked except for the name of the recipient typed in neat, simple letters. The postman handed it over without ceremony, unaware that the paper he carried was about to alter the course of a life. Inside a modest apartment on the outskirts of Vancouver, a stunt coordinator named Rachel sat at her kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee. Her phone buzzed with reminders of overdue bills, but she ignored them, too tired to care. When she picked up the envelope, she expected another notice, another demand. Instead, she slid her finger beneath the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper along with a cashier's check that made her breath catch in her throat. The note was handwritten. "Thank you for everything you have done. You made this possible." No signature, no explanation, just that. For a long moment, Rachel could not move. She stared at the check, blinking as if her eyes had betrayed her. The number printed there was more than her annual salary. She pushed her chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the worn linoleum, and stood in the quiet kitchen. Tears filled her eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. Her son, still in his pajamas, wandered in holding a toy truck, and she knelt down, clutching him with a fierce gratitude that words could not hold. For years, she had juggled 2 jobs, sneaking naps between shifts, missing birthdays and school plays, all to make ends meet. Now, in the palm of her hand, was a lifeline that had come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Across the ocean in Sydney, a lighting technician named Peter checked his mailbox after a grueling overnight shoot on another production. His back ached from hours of hoisting heavy rigs, his eyes gritty from lack of sleep. When he saw the envelope, he frowned, wondering what new paperwork awaited him. He opened it right there by the street lamp, squinting at the words on the note. The check slipped from his fingers and fluttered onto the damp pavement. He picked it up with trembling hands, reading the amount again and again, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He thought of his wife, who had been waiting for months to schedule a crucial medical procedure they could not afford. He thought of the nights he had worked through storms, drenched to the bone, to keep a scene lit just right. He thought of how no one ever thanked him, and then he laughed, a short, breathless sound, because gratitude had finally found him in the most unexpected way. In Los Angeles, Mark, the stuntman with the bad knees, sat in the corner of a crowded gym where he had been running low-budget training sessions for younger performers. His knee brace was frayed, his bank account nearly empty, but he kept teaching because he loved the craft. When his own envelope arrived, he tore it open casually, expecting a routine statement from the union. What he found inside stopped him cold. He sat there staring at the check, the noise of sparring gloves and punching bags fading into a distant hum. He ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, shaking his head, whispering to himself, "No way, no way." A fellow trainer noticed and asked if he was okay. Mark could not even answer. His eyes stung as he looked down again at the note. "You made this possible." He thought of the night he had limped off that rooftop, hiding his pain behind a grin. He thought of how much he had given to that film and how little he had expected in return. And now this quiet gift felt like the world finally saying, "I saw you, I remember you." One by one, across different cities, in small apartments and modest homes, similar stories unfolded. Stunt doubles sat down heavily in kitchen chairs, their hands pressed to their mouths. Camera operators called their spouses in disbelief, voices breaking as they tried to explain. Set builders who had spent years patching holes in their boots opened envelopes and realized they could finally pay off the mortgage or send their children to college. The notes were always the same, handwritten in that steady, thoughtful hand. "Thank you for everything you have done. You made this possible." No headlines, no press release, just a wave of quiet generosity moving through the industry like a whispered legend. As weeks passed, the ripple grew. People spoke in hushed tones on sets, sharing rumors about unexpected checks, mysterious benefactors, kindness with no strings attached. Some guessed, but few knew for certain. Those who suspected it was Keanu Reeves did not speak openly, out of respect for the silence he clearly wanted to maintain. Instead, they carried the knowledge in their hearts, letting it shape how they treated others. Lighting technicians began pooling resources to help colleagues in need. Stunt coordinators organized safer training environments, funded by their unexpected windfalls. Camera operators mentored newcomers without charge, feeling they were passing along a gift that had started with one man's decision. Even beyond the film industry, the impact was felt. Rachel used part of her gift to start a scholarship for women pursuing careers in stunt coordination, ensuring that others would have opportunities she had once struggled to find. Peter funded a small community project that provided better lighting and safety gear for local film students. Mark upgraded his gym, offering free classes to young performers who could not afford training. None of them announced these acts publicly. They did it quietly, mirroring the man who had inspired them. Kindness, after all, had its own rhythm, moving in circles that rarely made the news but changed lives nonetheless. Meanwhile, Keanu moved through his days as he always had, quietly without fanfare. He continued to ride the subway, to sip coffee in corner cafes, to walk through crowds unnoticed. He never asked for acknowledgement because that was never the point. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit in his apartment, looking out at the city lights, and wonder what those envelopes had set in motion. He would smile faintly, knowing that somewhere, someone was breathing easier, sleeping better, living with a little less fear because of a decision he had made in silence. The industry slowly began to shift in small ways. Producers took notice of how crews spoke more openly about their struggles. Some directors followed suit, offering better terms, better protections. It was not a revolution, but it was a beginning. A ripple that spread because one man refused to let success blind him to the people who made it possible. One afternoon, months later, Keanu was on another set, watching a stunt rehearsal for a new project. The sun was high, the air buzzing with activity. A young stunt woman approached him, nervous but determined. She held out a small handmade bracelet, explaining in a quiet voice that she had once been a student in Mark's gym, that his gym existed because of an unexpected gift, and that she had benefited in ways she could never repay. Keanu took the bracelet gently, sliding it over his wrist, and smiled. He did not ask for details. He did not need them. He simply nodded, and she walked away, her eyes bright. The bracelet caught the sunlight as Keanu turned back to the set, and in that moment he felt a deep sense of connection. The gesture had come full circle. What had started as a signature on a quiet afternoon had grown into something alive, something that moved through hands and hearts, touching lives far beyond what he had imagined. As evening fell, Keanu lingered on set long after most had left. He walked slowly through the empty spaces, past coiled cables and stacked equipment, breathing in the scent of sawdust and fresh paint. He thought of all the people who would return tomorrow, ready to build, to create, to risk and sweat and hope. He thought of how every frame of every film was a mosaic of unseen effort. He touched the bracelet on his wrist and smiled to himself. He could almost hear his mother's voice again, soft and wise. Kindness is not in what you show. Kindness is in what you give when no one is looking. And somewhere, in countless homes across the world, people who had once been invisible felt seen, valued, and remembered. That was the true magic, far greater than any special effect. It was the quiet magic of a man who had chosen to give without asking for anything in return. A magic that would keep rippling outward, changing lives long after the cameras stopped rolling. The city was quiet that night, its skyline glowing softly under a cloud-covered moon. Keanu sat alone in a corner booth of a nearly empty cafe, hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain mug. Steam curled upward from the coffee, carrying with it the faint scent of roasted beans and something sweet from the bakery counter. Outside, raindrops ticked against the window in a rhythm that felt familiar, almost like an old song. He had come here often over the years, drawn by the cafe's quiet anonymity and the way the light from a single hanging bulb softened the edges of the room. No one paid him much attention. To them, he was just another late-night customer lost in thought. In the dim reflection on the window, Keanu studied his own face. Lines traced the years on his skin. Years of relentless filming schedules, nights spent reading scripts under flickering lamps, moments of personal grief hidden behind calm smiles. He thought of the tragedies that had shaped him. The loss of a dear friend, the heartbreak of losing a child, the passing of someone he had loved deeply. Each wound had carved into him a deeper awareness of how fragile life could be. And yet, those same losses had also taught him how precious every small act of kindness truly was. He took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him, and listened to the faint jazz playing from an old speaker in the corner. A couple of tables away, a young man hunched over a laptop, typing furiously. His jacket damp from the rain. Keanu noticed the frayed backpack at the young man's feet, the nervous way he tapped his fingers against the keyboard, the faint circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Without thinking, Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded bill and slipping it under his saucer. When he left a few minutes later, he passed by the counter and quietly paid for the young man's coffee as well. He did not look back to see the surprise or gratitude. He never did. It was not about recognition. It was about the act itself. The belief that even the smallest kindness could shift someone's day, perhaps even their life. Later that week, he stood in a crowded subway car, one hand gripping the cool metal of a rail. Around him, people scrolled through phones, stared at their shoes, or watched the tunnels blur past. A woman carrying a sleeping child struggled to keep her balance as the train jolted. Without hesitation, Keanu rose and offered his seat, smiling softly as she lowered herself, cradling the child closer. A teenager nearby recognized him, eyes widening. But Keanu simply pressed a finger to his lips with a playful smile. The boy nodded, eyes shining with the excitement of a secret he would tell later. Moments like these were small, ordinary, but they were threads in the larger fabric of who Keanu had become. A man who believed that wealth was measured not in numbers but in the kindness you left behind. In the months following the envelopes, stories began to filter through the grapevine of the industry. A sound technician used the unexpected funds to finally buy hearing aids for his daughter. A set designer paid off debts that had haunted her for years, freeing her to pursue her own projects. A camera assistant, who had been living out of his car, finally found a home. Each story reached Keanu indirectly, told by friends of friends, whispered during shoots, shared quietly over late-night dinners. He never confirmed anything, never added details. He only smiled and listened, feeling a quiet satisfaction bloom in his chest. But there were nights, alone in his apartment, when the weight of his own journey pressed heavily on him. He would sit by the window, watching headlights stream by like constellations in motion, and reflect on the strange path his life had taken. Fame had never been his goal. He had stumbled into it with wide eyes and an open heart, only to discover its cost. He thought of the isolation that came with it, the way people saw the image but not the man. That invisibility, in some ways, mirrored the crew members he loved so deeply. They were unseen in their own way, their sacrifices hidden behind the glamour of a finished film. Perhaps that was why he felt such kinship with them, because he knew what it meant to feel invisible despite being present. One evening, after a long day of shooting, Keanu stayed behind on set while others celebrated at a wrap party. The cavernous soundstage was quiet, filled with half-dismantled props and the lingering scent of sawdust. He walked slowly among the remnants of the world they had built, trailing his fingers across painted backdrops, pausing to examine the intricate details no audience member would ever notice. He found himself standing before a massive lighting rig, cables coiled neatly on the floor, and imagined the hands that had done that work, the calluses, the late nights, the unnoticed skill. He whispered a soft thank you into the empty space, not expecting an answer, but feeling the words matter nonetheless. As he left the stage, he encountered a janitor sweeping near the exit. An older man with tired eyes and a slight stoop in his shoulders. Keanu stopped, offering a warm smile, and struck up a conversation. They spoke about the weather, about the janitor's favorite movies, about the long hours both of them had been working. Before leaving, Keanu shook the man's hand, slipping something small and folded into his palm. The janitor blinked in surprise but said nothing, tucking the folded bill into his pocket with a quiet nod. Keanu walked out into the night, feeling lighter. The world would never know most of these moments. They were too small, too intimate, too ordinary to make headlines. But they were the heartbeat of who Keanu was. The man behind the fame, behind the signature, behind the legend of kindness that quietly grew around him. His generosity was not just in grand gestures like signing away millions. It was in the hundreds of small acts woven through his daily life. Acts that collectively formed a portrait of a man who understood that life's true value was measured not by what you kept, but by what you gave. Months later, during a quiet interview, a journalist asked him directly about the rumors. Keanu smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners, and shook his head gently. "The crew makes the movie," he said softly. "They work harder than anyone knows. They deserve everything." The journalist pressed for details, but Keanu deflected with a modest shrug, steering the conversation back to the craft of storytelling, to the joy of collaboration. Those who knew the truth simply smiled when they heard the interview, recognizing the quiet humility in his words. In a world that often celebrates noise, Keanu chose silence. In a culture obsessed with self-promotion, he chose anonymity. And in an industry built on illusion, he chose a reality grounded in empathy. His life had been shaped by loss, by hardship, by a profound awareness of how fleeting everything could be. But instead of closing his heart, he had opened it wider, letting his kindness spill into every corner of the world he touched. On another rainy night, months after those envelopes had changed so many lives, Keanu walked home along a dimly lit street. The bracelet given to him by that young stunt woman rested against his wrist, catching the faint glow of street lamps. He slipped his hands into his pockets, shoulders hunched against the chill, and let his mind wander. Somewhere out there, someone was sitting at a kitchen table, paying bills without dread for the first time in years. Somewhere, a child was dreaming of college, unaware that a stranger's generosity had made it possible. Somewhere, a crew member was smiling in quiet disbelief, feeling seen at last. And as Keanu turned the corner toward his building, he smiled to himself, knowing that he would carry these invisible connections for the rest of his life. The evening sky over Los Angeles glowed with the last embers of sunlight, streaks of orange and violet melting into the deep blue of approaching night. Keanu stepped out of a small grocery store with a paper bag tucked against his chest, the kind of mundane errand most would never imagine a world-famous actor doing for himself. His hair was pulled back loosely, his jacket creased at the elbows, his boots scuffed from years of use. To anyone passing by, he was just another man walking home. The sidewalk buzzed with life, distant car horns, the laughter of children playing in a nearby park, the metallic rattle of a street performer's tambourine. But Keanu moved quietly through it all, a soft presence in a noisy world. He paused at the edge of the park, drawn by the sight of an older man sitting alone on a bench. The man's clothes were worn thin, his shoes splitting at the seams, and beside him sat a cardboard sign that read simply, "Trying to get home." Keanu approached without hesitation, setting his grocery bag down on the bench. The man looked up, startled, then relaxed at the gentle expression on Keanu's face. They spoke briefly about where home was, about how far he had come, about the long road still ahead. Keanu listened intently, his eyes warm, his words few but kind. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded envelope, and pressed it into the man's hand. The man started to protest, but Keanu shook his head with that same soft smile, picked up his groceries and walked on. Behind him, the man opened the envelope and gasped, tears welling up as he stared at the contents. Keanu never turned around. He did not need to. As he continued down the street, the city lights began to flicker on one by one. each lamp casting a pool of golden light onto the pavement. Keanu thought about the countless envelopes he had signed over the years, the silent waves of generosity he had sent out into the world. He thought of the letters he had never read, the gratitude he had never sought. Fame had taught him many lessons, but the greatest of them all was that true kindness does not need an audience, does not need applause. It exists in the quiet spaces between strangers, in the invisible threads that connect one life to another. Later that night, after placing his groceries on the counter, Keanu wandered out onto his balcony. The city stretched before him, alive with 1,000 tiny lights, each one a story, each one a heartbeat. He leaned against the railing, feeling the cool metal under his hands, and breathed deeply. In that moment, memories returned, not as sharp pains but as soft echoes. He saw again the faces of the crew from The Matrix, the way they had laughed through bruises and exhaustion. He heard the distant hum of the set, the clatter of equipment, the unspoken devotion that built each scene. He remembered the first time he had signed away a portion of his earnings, the ink drying on paper, the sudden rush of peace that had followed. Somewhere below, a subway rumbled by, its windows glowing as it disappeared into the dark. He imagined the passengers inside, tired workers heading home, families returning from long days, strangers sharing silent journeys. He thought about how often he had been one of them, riding unnoticed, finding comfort in the anonymity. That thought made him smile. Even now, after decades in the public eye, he still felt most himself in those unobserved moments when kindness could be given without expectation. A light breeze swept across the balcony, carrying with it the faint sounds of a city settling into night. Keanu closed his eyes, feeling the cool air against his face. He thought of his mother's words once more, words that had shaped him more than fame or fortune ever could. Kindness is not in what you show. Kindness is in what you give when no one is looking. He whispered those words softly, almost like a prayer, letting them hang in the air. Down on the street, a bus screeched to a halt, and through the window, Keanu caught sight of a young woman helping an elderly man with his bag. It was such a small act, so ordinary, but it filled him with a quiet joy. He knew that somewhere someone else was watching, learning, carrying that moment forward. That was how kindness worked, passed from one person to another, invisible yet powerful, unstoppable once it began. As the night deepened, Keanu retreated inside, setting his jacket on the back of a chair and placing the bracelet, the one gifted by the young stuntwoman, on his bedside table. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bracelet as if it were a map of everything he had tried to live by. Each small bead caught the dim light differently, each one a reminder of lives touched, burdens lifted, futures brightened. He smiled not because he felt proud, but because he felt connected. In the silence of that room, he spoke softly to himself, a simple truth that needed no audience. We are here to take care of each other. He lay back against the pillows, hands folded across his chest, and let his mind drift over all the unseen hands that had built his world. Camera operators, set designers, stunt teams, janitors, drivers, cooks, and so many more. Their names were written in his heart, even if the world would never know them. Outside, the city hummed its lullaby, the lights shimmering like distant stars. Somewhere, in homes far from Hollywood, people were living a little easier, breathing a little deeper, because of choices he had made in private. That knowledge was enough. It was more than enough. Keanu closed his eyes, and in that moment, the weight of his generosity felt lighter than air. The world would continue to tell stories about the man on screen, but the truest story was written in quiet gestures, in unseen ripples, in the simple, enduring truth that kindness, real, unconditional kindness, never needed to be seen to be felt.